Alright, so what we're going to find today are going to be the zeros of a polynomial. So what we'll do is just take the polynomial and set it equal to 0. And there's more than one way to solve this one, but what would you guys do if you were just solving it on your own? That's the quickest way to do it. Alright, then what? Square root. How many numbers are there that you can square and get 4? 2 and -2. So because 2 squared is 4, -2 squared is 4. So when we are solving equations by taking the square root, you always have to take the positive and negative square root because there's always a positive and negative version of the answer. All right, you guys try to do that same thing on your own for B. Okay, I'm seeing some people are saying it is also positive and -2. But if you square that, does that give you -4? It doesn't. And so most people just kind of stopped at this point, and they were like, I don't know. Some people did this, and we're just like, I don't know. Because there isn't a number that you guys know of that you can square and get a negative. Do you know the number? You know about I? Who taught you about it?
I did it online.
Oh, okay. All right. So there is somebody a long time ago, and I should have looked it up to see who it was, didn't like it, that there weren't zeros to functions like that. So what they did is they created or developed this imaginary unit that's called I. And I is always equal to the square root of -1. So I'm going to go back up, and I'm going to try to have an answer for this. So I'm going to break the square root of -4 down to the square root of 4 times the square root of -1. So what is the square root of 4? Just 2. And what is the square root of -1? I. So now we do have two answers, 2i and -2i, that I can put in for x and have it equal to 0. All right, so before we check that to make sure it really works, what do you guys think I squared is? If I is the square root of -1, what should I squared be? Just -1. So we now know a whole new group of numbers that are imaginary numbers. And we'll do more stuff with them, but today is just kind of like an intro. All right, so let's make sure that when I plug in, let's just do -2i. If I plug in -2i into my function, see if we actually get 0. All right, so what is -2 squared? 4. And what is I squared? Yes. All right, and so I get -4 plus 4, which is 0. So it is definitely a 0. It's just an imaginary 0. All right, so we're going to do some factoring, and then, well, actually on E we're not going to factor, but we're going to do some factoring, which is something you definitely did in Algebra 2. Some of you are probably better at it than others, so I'm going to go kind of slow and write some notes. If you remember everything there is to remember about factoring, you don't have to write all my little notes. But on letter A, we're going to find the zeros by factoring, and so we're going to set it equal to 0. I can't solve this one like I just did on example 1 because both terms have an x. So if both terms have an x, you can't get something on one side and do a root or whatever. It's going to be a little more challenging. So we're going to factor it. Does anyone know the first step to factoring this? Yes, good job. We're going to factor out the greatest common factor. What is the greatest common factor? Yes. Right, and when I factor out a common factor, it's like the reverse of the distributive property. And so when you do distributing, you're multiplying. When you're factoring out, you're dividing. So if I divide x's, what do I do with the exponents? Subtract. So when I divide out x squared, it leaves me with x squared. What about if I factor x squared out as 6x squared? Good. You guys are great factorers. You do? I was about to say I never hear that, but I love factoring. Okay, so now we're going to set each, well actually, if you multiply and get 0, what does one of those things have to be? To multiply and get 0, you have to multiply by 0. The only way you can get 0 when multiplying is if you multiply by 0. So if these multiply together to get 0, it means that one of them is 0. So we set each of them equal to 0. So some of you might remember that's what you do, but it's also, I think, important, hey Torin, that you remember that's why you do it. All right, so now what we're going to do is solve each of these for x. And so on the x squared equals 0, we would do the positive and negative square root. But what is the square root of 0? 0. Is 0 positive or negative? It's neither. You guys are so smart. All right, and then on the second one, we are going to subtract that 6. Take the positive and negative square root. All right, so anytime you see that there's a negative under that square root, I hope that you just think, oh yeah, there's just going to be an I in the answer. I don't necessarily want you to go through this process every time. You can. You will always get the right answer. But I think you can just be like, okay, there's a negative, so I'm going to pull an I out. It sounds gross, but it's okay. You're going to pull out an I, and then you're going to think about it just like a positive 6 underneath there. And then if there is no square other than 1 that divides into 6, you're done. Is there a square that divides into 6? No. So that's it. These are our answers. We have 3 answers. 0, positive I squared of 6, and negative I squared of 6. All right, let's look at B. So for B, we are going to set the function equal to 0 to find the zeros. Whoops. And this is just going to be factoring a trinomial, regular old factoring, where we do the 2 sets of parentheses. All right, so what you put here and here needs to multiply to give you x squared. So what is that going to be? X and x. Good job. All right, then I always look at my very last sign to decide if these are going to be positives or negatives. What do you think for a minus? Very good. That means the signs are different. So one will be plus and one will be minus. All right, and then what we put here and here needs to multiply to give you 8. And then because there is no number in front of the x squared, they're going to multiply to get 8 and add or subtract to get 7. It needs to multiply to get 8. It's okay. It's okay. So it's going to be 8 And then if I do a positive 8 and a negative 1, they subtract to give you 7, or technically add to give you 7. Okay, now we can set each of these equal to 0. Can you just look at those factors and tell what the zeros are? I don't know. I've never really taught you guys algebra, so I'm not 100% sure. Negative 8 and positive 1. So you're going to do the opposite. What if there was a number in front? Like if this had been 2x minus 1, what would you do with that 2?
I'm going to see multiple on quiz, so I don't know.
You remember what you made on that quiz? You would divide by it. So if there's a number in front of your x, you're going to divide by it. We'll do some of those, don't worry. All right, let's look at the next one. All right, this one starts off a lot like the one right above it, where we're going to factor out a common factor, and it actually is the same common factor. All right, now there's different things you can do. You can solve it kind of like what we did on example 1a. But there's another way to factor it. I just want to show you because you might have to do that another time, like in the next problem. So we're going to factor using the difference of squares. So we have this x squared that's just going to hang out. And difference of squares is something you do in Algebra 2, and it's super easy, but the problem with things being super easy is a lot of times you forget how to do it the next year or the next month. So if you notice that they're both perfect squares and you're doing subtraction, you can use the difference of squares, where you're going to find each square root. So what's the square root of 9x squared? 3x. So we do 3x and 3x. One's a plus and one's a minus. And then you do the square root of 4, which is going to be 2. So 2 and 2. All right. So now we're going to see if we can just look at these factors and tell the zeros. So what about x squared? Yes. What about the next one? Negative 2 over 3. Good. And the last one? Good job. Now, if you can't do that in your head, it's okay. You can just set each of them equal to 0 and solve by hand. It doesn't matter to me. All right, I want to see what you guys can figure out on D on your own. I'm going to give you a hint, though. It's going to be difference of squares to factor it. So to do that step where you just look at the factors and tell the zeros, they need to be linear factors, which means they don't have an exponent or the exponent is 1. This, your answer is not going to be like 9 and negative 9 because of the squared. So that's okay. So what we would need to do is set these equal to 0. Now x squared minus 9, you can factor again if you want to. If you factored it twice, don't change it, it's right. Okay, so now I would subtract that 9 and then do the positive and negative square root. Bless you. So, say it loud and proud if you know it. What is the square root of negative 9? I don't know if I heard it. Did you say 3i? Positive and negative 3i. It's okay. It's the first day you've learned about I. It's fine. So because it's a negative under the square root, you're going to have an I. And then the square root of 9 is just 3. So 3i. All right. So same thing on this one, except we don't get anything weird. We just do the square root. And we get positive and negative 3. So that's 4 answers to that, or 4 zeros to that function. 2 imaginary and 2 real. All right, any questions on that? If you didn't get that by yourself, it's okay. I'm not worried. You're fine. Okay, this next one, we are not going to factor it. So I wouldn't recommend factoring it unless it is in standard form where there's no parentheses and all your terms are lined up nice and pretty. So we're still going to find the zeros by setting the function equal to 0. And then we're just going to use our algebra skills to figure this out. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you, at no time in this problem are we going to square x minus 1, or x plus 1. It is not happening. So keep that in mind. We're trying to solve this for x. What would you guys do first? Move the 25. Good job. All right, we are not going to square x plus 1, but we have to get to that x. So what are we going to do? Square root. It's okay. All right, loud and proud. What is the square root of negative 25? 5i, yes. All right, we almost have x. So this is x plus 1. So we are going to subtract the 1. Do you think I can subtract the 1 from the I? No. So when we subtract it, we're just going to move it over in the front. You can put it at the end either. It doesn't matter. Typically, you see it in front of the plus or minus in the answer choices. All right, so you kind of treat I like it's a variable. It is not a variable. A variable varies, which means from problem to problem, sometimes the answer is 5, sometimes the answer is negative 7. What is I always? The square root of negative 1, always. It is not a variable, but sometimes it acts like one. The rules are similar. Okay, this is probably the most difficult one to factor. Does this one have a common factor? No. So we're going to factor it like a trinomial. Why is this one more difficult than B? Because of the 2. But we can still do it. We can figure this out in just like a few tries, I'm pretty sure. So what we put here and here still needs to give you 2x squared. 2x and x. This sign still tells you what those need to be. So if it's a minus, plus and minus. I might have to switch those in a second, so I just usually go ahead and just make them different and then take care of it later. Okay, what goes here and here needs to multiply to give you 14. But how do you get the negative 3? There is nothing that multiplies to get 14 and adds to get 3. So you do add something, but you maybe just don't know how to articulate what you add. It's okay. So this gets multiplied by this. That gets multiplied by that. Those are going to add to give you negative 3x. So there's only 2 pairs of numbers that multiply to give you 14. Now I'm going to tell you something that your Algebra 2 teacher might not have told you or might have told you, and I don't know. So this 2, it matters. You cannot put something inside that set of parentheses that has a common factor with that 2. All right. So if I was going to use this, what cannot be with the 2? 14. If I was going to use this, 2 cannot be with the 2. So which ones do you guys want to try? 7 and 2. So I can put the 7 with the 2. I can put the 2 over in the other one. Let's see what happens when I do my multiplication. So that's going to be 7x. That's going to be negative 4x. Does that give me what I want? Almost. What does that give us? That gives us positive 3. So I have the right number and the wrong sign. What do? Just switch the signs and you got it. Everybody can factor. It might take a little bit longer in ones like that. You might have to try a couple different things, but everybody can do it. So what does that make my zeros? Yes. All right, so your assignment is on the back of this. I have already posted the answers, but make sure you're showing me your factoring if there's factoring to do or any steps that you need to do.